Hi, everybody. Today's Thursday, July 10th, 2025, and our friends Richard Wolff and Michael Hudson are back with us. Welcome back.
Glad to be here. Yeah.
Yeah, let me start, Michael, with what's going on with BRICS here in Brazil, in Rio de Janeiro. They've started the summit and they were talking about many things, but one of the main issues that they were talking about is the tariff and how the tariff issue is they're trying to deal with tariffs and the way that the United States is dealing with the rest of the world. You're taking that so far with the BRICS summit.
Well, I think as far as the response of the BRICS is concerned, they're really Russia and China. Russia's President Putin and Sergei Lavrov have been the most explicit in spelling out exactly what the BRICS need, and for the obvious reasons that Russia and China are the main object of the U.S. attack, which includes the attack on BRICS. I think that the breakaway from U.S. control is made urgent right now because of the actions of Trump's administration. But the rest of the BRICS are more reactive than proactive. They're complaining, but they haven't really put in what are the specific policies that they can impose to free themselves, and that is really what's needed. And they haven't gone to that yet. And what they're dealing with is the fact that Trump realizes what economists and the public shied from acknowledging, that the post-war American era is over. But there's still very little discussion of creating a real alternative. And the BRICS closing report emphasized that they want higher quotas for the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. But that doesn't provide an alternative to the U.S. neoliberal worldview. It doesn't really talk about what kind of alternative institutions they need to avoid the whole kind of neoliberal development trap that was imposed by America in 1945 and has made itself very rich for the 80 years past, but is not making America rich anymore. So all of a sudden, America is changing all of the rules. And the fact is, the BRICS have yet to decide their own rules. And the only alternatives of a leader that I see are those by the Russian leaders. So I think what's happening, I want to say what's happening in the US so I can put the context for the BRICS. And what's happening in America is much like happened to the Soviet Union in the 1990s when it was breaking up. There's a grabitization, a grab bag. The post-war elite see that the game is over and they're taking everything they can to get out at the economy's expense. They're carving it up, raising monopoly prices, lowering the tax on themselves, cutting off government programs. The class war is really back in business. And I think the same thing is happening in Europe. The European military stocks are soaring in price, and governments are scaling back public spending and creating a social crisis. Then Britain, Germany, and France, wages are going down. Same thing's happening in Japan. So the American allies are part of experiencing the same kind of breakdown that the United States is. And the question is, what's going to take the place of this new kind of grabitization where the United States says, well, we can't follow the old rules of free trade and investment that made us rich for the last 80 years. We're going to impose tribute on you. What are you going to do about it? And the question is, can the West prevent the global majority, which I think is more important than the BRICS, from becoming just a prosperous new center growing without the United States control and making itself the beneficiary of its trade and investment, not foreign investors. And all the United States can do to stop it right now is to act as a wrecker. And within BRICS, it's trying to use, I think, India and Brazil to weaken any real break from U.S. policy. And I think Trump's imposition of the 50% tariffs on Brazil yesterday was trying to bully it into submission to the United States. And he said if Brazil imposes reciprocal tariffs on the United States, he's going to raise the tariffs on Brazil more than 50%. And after I hear Richard's take, I want to discuss what I think the global majority and the BRICS really need.
Go ahead, Richard.
Okay. I agree, but I would come at it, I guess, a little differently. I've been struck by what the BRICS have achieved. I agree with Michael. The blueprint for how to get beyond where we are now is not there yet. I don't think they've come up with it. I think they are not sure themselves. I think there are too many disagreements and divisions among them that they haven't worked out. Can you hold a second? I'm sorry, I have to get this.
Michael, go ahead.
Okay.
Richard can join us in a minute.
Well, the key is that the world's splitting into two parts. And the U.S. Diplomats see this as a civilizational split. They see it as a civilization split, but the BRICS and the global majority aren't treating it this way. There's a break from the past, but they're not looking at the fact that they're in the same position today that Britain and France and Europe was in 200 years ago, when they were trying to free themselves from feudalism, from the fact that there was a hereditary aristocracy charging land rent, all sorts of, and industrial capitalism wanted to free itself from all of this. That's what the BRICS will have to do. I'll say that after Richard finishes what he's saying.
Go ahead, Richard.
Yeah. So let me point out that we oughtn't to be in a rush. I mean, Michael is right, but it's really only been whatever it is, 16 or 17 years that we've had the BRICS. The first few was just getting it started. Now they are clearly underway. They have grown in number. They have the two levels of participation, the member and the partner, if I have their language correctly. And they did hit that milestone a week or two ago when the total amount of trade among them crossed the $1 trillion value. And that's an impressive development. And we all have to thank Mr. Trump, because his tariff program has been a tremendous boost on increasing trade among them, since obviously when they trade amongst each other, Mr. Trump's tariffs don't have any impact, at least not directly on what's going on with them. So I'm pretty impressed that, given all of their differences on many, many issues, that they've been able to stay together. The second thing I would argue is the grabization. I like the term of if Michael invented that. Grabbing everything is a good metaphor, but I would like to extend it a little further. The tariff game has a number of benefits to it. Number one, it can exact a certain amount of tribute. Although let's remember, in the end, the tribute is going to be coming from the Americans to a defunct government, and we don't know yet how much of it will be in the end funded by the other countries. Mr. Trump loves to talk about tariffs, about what they do to the other country. But the first victim of a tariff are the Americans who have to pay it, not the foreigners. And it's an open question, depending on many variables, as to how much of the tariff the American who pays it will be able to push back on the foreign country to lower their prices to offset the tariff's effect. Some of that will happen. but much of the effect will be the effect of raising prices in the United States. Let me give you one example that became popular 24 hours ago. It turns out that the vast majority of shoes that Americans wear, like 90+%, which are sneakers as well as shoes, are imported. And they're imported mostly from about 6 countries, all of whom have enormous tariffs that have been imposed on them. And the estimate of the American shoe companies is that they will have to raise the prices about 37% to deal with the tariffs of 40 to 50 to 60% that have been levied on many of the countries that produce, for example, shoes. Now, that part of the inflation hasn't hit yet in the United States, but it is being already factored in to the calculations of all of these companies. So I think it's important to understand that the effect of the tariffs in terms of the U.S. versus BRICS or the rest is an unresolved, unknowable at this moment sharing of the process, and not at all difficult necessarily. Third, that the levying of tariffs, and it's clear that Trump understands this part of it, is a way of breaking up any unity, whether it's a unity between, I don't know, Vietnam and China around certain issues, or the unity that the BRICS have established among the members and partners of their thing, because what it does is it encourages the countries to compete with one another for the favor of the United States. So this is clearly divisive for the BRICS. It means that they are perhaps saying one thing while cutting deals with Washington underneath the surface. We will learn about that in the months and years ahead, but it would be naive not to think that that's going on. You can see the impact of that particular strategy because its biggest victim is Europe, where the failure to get together there is because none of those countries trusts the other one in terms of secret deals with the United States. The continent doesn't trust Britain and vice versa. France and Germany do not trust each other. Each one worries that if they go too far in being anti-Trump, he will favor the other ones over them, blah, blah, blah. Europe has been suffering from the failure of how it came out of feudalism with all this nationalist noise has cost them very dearly ever since. And here, finally, another dimension. If you look closely at what Trump said about the threat to Brazil and the tariff of 50%, the argument he made was that he wants to stop the investigation of Bolsonaro in Brazil by the Brazilians. He's not happy with that. He wants allies over there, and he wants to punish them because of their internal judicial procedures, which is a remarkable rationale for a tariff. I mean, we don't used to see quite that kind of thing. That would have been kept a secret, that was also an objective in all of this. But given the way Mr. Trump works, this all does seem to be a mess of tariffs interwoven with ideological commitments, interwoven with long-term political goals that are poorly defined and probably not achievable anyway. So I'm driven to do what my friend Yanis Varoufakis does, to find the method in the madness. And I'm glad we're doing that, and we should do it. But we shouldn't forget that there's a lot of madness here and a lot of driven, multiple clashing objectives that are not going to work out. And that'll help us avoid seeing too much logic, too much management. And so I end up not being critical so much of the BRICS, easy though that is to do. Could they do more? Yes. Could they have gone further? Yes. But even Lula, if I could conclude on that, did an interesting thing in his most recent speech that I've read, in which he says, I am not one of those who attacks globalization. He said the problem wasn't globalization. The problem was, and he doesn't use these words, but I'll put them in his mouth, American imperialism. The United States used a globalized economy to its own ends. Mr. Lula wants everyone to understand that globalization is still on the agenda, and he, for one, favors it. And I see there the echo of the Chinese supporting free trade and all of the others, and repositioning the world around this old capitalist struggle, free trade versus protectionism. And they are becoming cleverly the champions of a free trade regime over against the narrow, backward looking, remember, MAGA, backward looking protectionism. And that, I think, is a very powerful image, and changes. It kind of changes what is the advanced world and what is the less developed world. And it substitutes, and that's what Michael, in a way, is asking for, is substituting not the strategy of economic development, that remains to be spelled out, but it is very smartly reconceptualizing what's going on in the world around the globalization, protectionism. And that is very different from what the United States is trying to construct as the way to understand the world economy.
Well, I think you're right. What is really at issue is what kind of an economic system is the world going to have, at least the world outside of the United States. And it's not just, the problem is not just capitalism, it's particularly the European and the American version of what capitalism has begun, which is very different from how it began. And I'd like to make the point that the global majority countries today are facing a problem very much like was faced by Europe when it broke away from feudalism, from the control of the past, from the control of a predatory, hereditary aristocracy that was holding the land and charging its rents and establishing monopolies to pay its foreign debts, and had a predatory banking system. The whole system had to be revised, and that's what made industrial capitalism revolutionary. Industrial capitalism wanted to free economies from this whole burden of the rentier class that had emerged out of feudalism. And the solution to do it is Adam Smith and the French physiocrats and everybody, the rest of the classical economists were saying is, well, first of all, if they're rentiers, they live on economic rent, unearned income. If we tax the land, if we tax the monopolies or prevent monopolies and make them into the public domain, then we're going to become a low-cost economy. And in fact, if England is going to be the workshop of the world, we cannot afford to have the costs of this post-feudal rentier class. We're going to have to get rid of them. Well, let's look at the situation today. Just as Britain and France and Germany had to free their economies from feudalism's rentier burden, the BRICS countries and most of the global majority countries need to free themselves from the rent overhead inherited from the epoch of European colonialism and its creditor control. But the problem is that this rentier control is international. It's foreign. It's American and European, much more than domestic investors. It's the multinational firms that have taken control of the raw materials resources, the mineral resources, the oil, and the land. It's the foreign investors that have bought up the natural infrastructure monopolies and are bleeding them for everything they can do. And it's the foreign investors that have financed local banking and control the local credit system along neoliberal lines. So the what is unique today is that the BRICS haven't come up with the same solution that the classical economists came up with to free industrial capitalism in the early 19th century from all of this feudal structure. And that's what needs to be done, and yet they don't have a, a body of classical economists. Most of their economists have been sent to and their officials and their administrators have been sent to American universities to study. And if they take an economics course, there's nothing about classical economics. It's all about no such thing as economic rent. Everybody earns whatever they have. There's no exploitation at all. Whereas classical economics was it's all about exploitation. That's what economic rent is. It's unearned income. Well, today the unearned income isn't paid simply to the global majorities of the BRICS domestic ruling class. It's paid to American and European foreign investors, multinationals. And if they were to do what Europe did to become a competitive industrial economy, they'd say, well, we have sovereignty, and our sovereignty is going to be to do just what Adam Smith and his John Stuart Mill and his followers said. We're going to tax the economic rent of the oil industry, the mining industry. We're going to tax away monopolies, and we're going to have our own antitrust laws, and so that foreign investors can make normal profits on what they invest, but we're not going to let them make super profits in economic rent. And we're going to define the income they make, the taxable income, as their overall cash flow. We're not going to allow foreign investors to say, we didn't make any income because we spent all of our income paying interest to ourselves and charging depreciation on the oil and minerals that we exhaust. Well, that's a tax write-off for this. I'm sorry, you don't get any taxes. The entire system that has been put in place to promote the anti-classical, pro-rentier ideological revolution that occurred in the early 20th century and flowered under Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan has to be replaced by what was, by the late 19th century, industrial capitalism evolving into socialism, into a mixed public-private economy where the government regulated natural monopolies, it taxed away economic rent. And the idea of a free market, as we've discussed before, for the classical economists was a market free from economic rent, not free for the rentiers, not to have any government taxation or regulation of the economy. So suppose that the BRICS countries said, we're going to develop our industry in the same way that England, France, Germany, and the United States developed their industry, with a mixed public-private economy, blocking economic rent from adding to the cost of production. And if we don't do that, we can't industrialize. And by the way, the other feudal burden we have that is the equivalent of the feudal burden is the foreign debt that we've been loaded down with by the way in which the post-war economic order was created in 1945. The global South countries emerged from World War II with very abundant foreign reserves because they've been selling raw materials to the Allies during the war. And the way in which the United States designed the IMF and the World Bank and the free trade agreement led to the global South countries losing these reserves that they'd been developing during the war by falling into trade dependency and increasingly into debt dependency. All of that has to be thrown away, just as Europe threw away the feudal burden, the feudalism that it had, and the fight against to free themselves from the foreign investment that mainly is coordinated by the United States, as Lula said, is the counterpart to how Europe achieved its prosperity. And you can see, I think, Foreign Minister Lavrov of Russia described a wonderful speech about the need, he said, to establish foreign trade mechanisms that the West will be unable to control, such as transport corridors, alternative payment systems, and supply chains. And as an example of, he cited how the United States has paralyzed the World Trade Organization that it created on the basis of free trade, but now it's not free trade doesn't help America because America's deindustrialized. And what Lavrov said, I'll quote: "When the Americans realized that the globalized system they'd created, one built on fair competition, inviolable property rights, the presumption of innocence, and similar principles, and which had allowed them to dominate for decades, had also begun to benefit their rivals, primarily China, and they took drastic action. As China started outplaying them on their own turf and by their own rules, Washington simply blocked the WTO's appellate body by artificially stripping it of a quorum. They rendered this the key dispute settlement mechanism inactive, and it remains to this day." Well, what if the BRICS and the global majority countries were saying, what China has done is, in a way, follow the exact logic of industrial capitalism when it was emerging? China's kept property and land in the public domain. It hasn't permitted monopolies to be private. It hasn't permitted a private banking system to financialize the economy and make loans for corporate takeovers and buy up industrial corporations and use their profits for stock buybacks and dividend payouts. China has done exactly what Adam Smith and John Stuart Mill and the industrial capitalists wanted to do, because industrial capitalism was evolving into just exactly the lines that China has been taking. And for the BRICS to become independent of this system that has driven them into debt and trade dependency and food dependency, they would have to say, all right, China has provided a modern version of the classical free market model, free of exploitative rents, and we're going to follow that. But that requires us stripping away the foreign ownership of our oil, raw materials, resources, our monopolies. And if we can't nationalize them, we realize that's out of the question, at least we can tax all of their unearned income, the unearned income that David Ricardo and Smith and John Stuart Mill and Marx and Veblen, the whole 19th century, spent so much effort defining.
Let me get at this in a slightly different way, I think, that can also capture this. And here I'm going to be relying on Marx and his particular way of dealing with this. You might say that the break out of feudalism comes, whether it's in the form of Smith and Ricardo or any of the others, comes out of a recognition that rent on land has much to do with the growth of population. That's why a square foot in New York City costs a great deal more than a square foot in Nebraska, right? It is not about the soil. It's not about investments that have been put on the land or not. It's basically that more and more people getting an advantage out of being in an agglomerated population enable whoever owns the land simply to raise the rent, and it becomes more and more. And the anti-feud people can be thought of as having come up with a Eureka moment. And in the Eureka moment, they realized that in order to have access to land, you do not need a landlord. In other words, you can, figuratively or not, get rid of the landlord and you still have the land, which is what the rest of the population, the rest of the economy needs. Well, Marx, in a moment of humor, said the only difference between him and those folks who figured out what I just said is that he wants to add that exactly the same is true of capital. Do we need machines? Yeah, absolutely. Do we need factories and offices? Yes. Do we need the owners of those things who can take huge portions of our output in order to give us access? No. We can produce those things. You know how we know it? Because we already do. It's workers who make machines. It's workers who erect buildings. It's workers who do all that anyway. So if the workers do it, why would there be others who aren't workers gathering a revenue? It makes no more sense, Marx says, than having the landlord who inherited from his grandfather a certain spot of land being able to siphon off a huge amount of revenue. And then the punchline, which is just as Michael said, if that revenue were acquired by an agency of the community that wanted economic development, then of course they would use those revenues for that purpose. And that is the old socialist idea. The people do the work. They produce consumer goods for their own consumption. They produce means of production in order to become more productive as a community. In order for this story to be told, you don't need a separate social class gathering into its hands the revenue and only devoting that to growing the well-being of the community if that were their objective. But we know that if there is such a class, capitalism guarantees that the objective they will pursue with the revenue they get is profitability. And profitability has nothing to do with the realities that system imposes on us relative to what a community of workers would do if they themselves were in charge here. So let me offer, as Michael did, to the BRICS a strategic focus that might make a real difference. And that is to say that the socialism that they have produced to this point, government with a massive regulatory and ownership, as in China, for example, but that is a step, probably a necessary step, but not a sufficient step. That what you have to do is to take it further. You have to really put the workers in charge, not indirectly, not through electing some. No. You have to, at the base, in every office, in every factory, in every store, put the people who work there in charge. There is no capitalist class anymore. You actually have overcome class divisions because the employer and the employee have become the same persons. One individual, the other one a member of the collective. And that's what you got. No more master slave, no more lord serf, and no more employer employee. Then you have the micro foundation to get the very things Michael is talking about to become possible. But that means that in the BRICS countries, and there is no way that I can see out of this, in the BRICS countries, to the extent that there remain employer-employee organizations, you're going to have to go beyond them. And you're going to have resistance from whoever the employers are, whether these are private individuals or state officials. You're going to have to bite the bullet, not in support of an abstract idea, but in support of the necessary foundation for that alternative organization of the world economy that Michael is talking about, and that the BRICS are moving toward, but are not there yet.
Well, moving toward that leaves the question is, how do you get from where you are now to where you have described as the ultimate dream of socialism? And Marx dealt with that. He really was the inventor of cost accounting for industrial capitalism. And he said that the industrial capitalist was much more than a landlord. The landlord's rent did not add to value. It added to price, but there was no cost of production for land, because land was provided freely by nature. But as you said, as the economy becomes more prosperous and population grows, there's an unearned increment. The landlord did nothing. But Marx said the capitalist does do something. The capitalist organized industry, and Marx included the capitalist's profit as value, not as economic rent, because he said the role of industrial capitalists is to make money by making surplus value, by employing labor, selling its product at a profit, more than they have to pay the labor and the cost of production. But the dynamic of industrial capitalism was that the firm, in order to grow, plows its profit back into more capital investment and more employment. And in that sense, he said the capitalist plays a productive role under capitalism. He says ultimately, as the role as capitalism plays this role of creating industry on a larger and larger scale, it is preparing the whole structure for socialists to take over, and at a point for there to be socialist management. And he described the whole structure of the capitalist's income. Here is the earned part of income, the actual profits on the necessary capital investment for factories. But the cost of producing capitalist industry included land rent and other factors. These should not be tax deductible at all. So Marx refined the whole tax ideology of Adam Smith and Ricardo and John Stuart Mill and made sense of it all, and said that the industrial capitalist was the key to the transition to socialism. And just as China permits private profit-making investment, private capitalism on a small scale to develop, but it doesn't let billionaires develop, and it doesn't let industrial capitalism by its innovative class, which is very innovative, it doesn't let it become financialized and turn into financial capitalism, which has ended up destroying and deindustrializing capitalism in the Western economies. That's the big picture. I think that the BRICS and global South economies have. But to do that, they need a whole idea of cost accounting and how exactly do you tax these firms so that you say, we're not going to nationalize you, we're just going to make sure that you actually earn what you produce. If you make a capital investment, the value of the physical capital, mining equipment and oil drilling equipment, you're permitted to a regular profit on that, 6, 7, 8%, whatever it is. You're not allowed to make a profit on the vast economic rent investments that you've made. That's not an investment. So we're dealing with a whole different concept of national income, gross national product, and to get rid of transfer payments to the foreign investors that are not part of the product at all, but are a transfer just essentially a tribute to the rentier class that's largely foreign. So I wanted to introduce that. In order to do that, they'd have to read volume 2 and 3 of Capital to pick up where classical economics actually evolved into in the 19th century.
Yeah, I don't think we disagree, except for me, I want to stress the micro level adjustment change that radically reorganizes every enterprise in order that then they can together do what you just said. In the interest of reproducing their power and their social situation, they have to have those kinds of rules in place. So that, for example, no one enterprise, even if it is organized as a cooperative, can have a monopoly position. That is not available. Whereas we know that in capitalism, the competitive nature always produces winners and losers and has no reason not to go until there's only 1 or 2 or 3 monopoly or oligopoly that's left. And that the production of a monopolist is intrinsic to the capitalist system. It constantly produces and reproduces them. That's why there is Jeffrey Bezos and there is old Elon Musk and all the rest of it. It is the not only is there nothing preventing it, the system is set up so that every capitalist that I've ever met dreams of having quote unquote market share. Well, that's a none too subtle idea. That's about getting the ability to jack your price up above what it would be if you did the kind of cost calculation Michael just specified. If we're going to do our job, we have to specify the political economy that could set itself the task of limiting monopoly. We tried that. We had the Sherman antitrust bill in 1890. We had the Clayton Act in 1914. Those are spectacular failures. They haven't stopped monopolization. Never did. It is a fraud. We have an antitrust department that's another fraud that doesn't do its job. And it doesn't do it whether it's Republican or Democrat, because that's built into the system. Bank finance depends on what kind of market share you can promise the banker you can get with a loan that allows you to wipe out your competitor. That would not be possible if you differentially organized the base. They would not permit that because they can all be victimized by it in a way that could actually stick. And I think, therefore, that these are the next steps of a BRICS. But there's another dimension to this that I don't want to lose, and I would like to hear Michael's comments, which is, it seems to me that the BRICS already are a historical transformation. The fact that if you add up, I know I've done this before, but I want us to think about it. If you add up the GDP, the gross domestic product of all the BRICS countries now, we're talking roughly 35% of global GDP. The G7, that's the United States and its major allies, if you add up their GDP, we're talking about 27, 28%. For me, that's it. We're done. We are no longer where we were for the 80 years since Bretton Woods. That is, in a world economy where the United States and its allies are the obvious global world-shaping economic power, and with that, the political, military, and ideological. We are not the economic center of the world economy. The United States isn't. And the gap, we crossed the line in 2020. So here we are 5 years later, and the gap has gotten only bigger in favor of the BRICS and against the United States. This, in my judgment, sits as a relentless pressure on Mr. Trump, on everybody in this country, whether they admit what I just said as a statistic or they don't, consciously or unconsciously. They have a sense, an ominous sense, that the march of time itself is now their enemy. And so there's a desperation that then comes and produces that grabbing mentality that Michael started us off with today. But that is a mentality grounded in an actual material transformation. And the BRICS, I suspect, somewhere, they know it too. They don't know what to do quite. Michael is right. They don't know quite to do what to do. On the other hand, they are trading more with one another than they ever have, and it is not only emergency trading. In other words, it's not just Russia selling oil and gas to China and India because they can't manipulate. And now a final word, because Michael mentioned the Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov. In the same speech that Michael refers to, Lavrov gives a statistic, and I've checked it, and it's correct. Here it is, and it's something to think about. Since the war in Ukraine began, so early 2022, the World Bank, a Western institution created by the Bretton Woods meetings, has given more money to Ukraine than twice as much as it gives annually to Africa. Now, let me remind you, the population of Ukraine is 39 million people. The population of Africa is 1.55 billion people. Now, there is no justification on earth for such behavior, except if you are desperate and you're mobilizing every nickel you can. You don't care what the fall. That's behavior of people very different from what we used to see. It's just like Mr. Trump ending foreign aid to Africa and then inviting those 5 sad leaders yesterday to talk to him. Twice as much for the war in Ukraine, the 39 million people affected, then you give annually to 1.55 billion. It is stupefying if you think about it. Think about the economic development message here. Helping Ukraine basically blow away everything because the money is used for war, versus helping 1.5 billion people who are the victims of economic underdevelopment par excellence in the world we live in. It really is kind of breathtaking.
Richard, the population of Ukraine is only 1,000 people.
Yeah.
These 1,000 people get all of the IMF, all of the World Bank money. That's the population. It's 1,000 people, not the rest of the population. This money doesn't get spent on the population at large. It's to the client oligarchy. That's the key. But I want to go back to what you talked about, the march of time. The question is, how does the American government, that seems to be the most proactive mover right now under Trump, how does it stop the march of time from moving in a direction that is not in the American national interest? How does it prevent the BRICS from developing? That is really what I think should have been the whole focus of the conference. in Brazil. And I think the U.S. plan is indeed, as you point out, based on monopoly. And in fact, the head of the Federal Reserve this week made very much the point that you're making about monopoly pricing. He said, Donald Trump is trying to force me to treat to raise interest rates, to stop the rise in pricing. He's going to try to do that. The rise in interest rates is not caused by money creation. The rise of interest rates has nothing to do with money creation. Companies are realizing that there is no antitrust enforcement at all, that they can just gouge and gouge and gouge their customers. The grocery stores are gouging. Everybody's gouging the customers. That's what he said. And of course, that's right. And on the largest scale, I think how is the U.S. going to survive as a monopoly country, imposing of all the rest of the BRICS and the rest of the world to its monopoly rights and the related rentier privileges that are uniquely favorable to itself on the whole world's trade and investment? Well, Trump's America wants to make other countries dependent on America's information technology, its internet platforms, its military technology. It wants to become itself the great monopoly power over other countries. And that's the only, if it can't achieve its dominance by industrialization, it can achieve it by post-industrial monopoly capitalism that turns out to be the final stage of finance capitalism in this case. And so for Trump and for the United States, the rule of law is based on one that permits unilateral U.S. demands to impose trade and financial sanctions, dictating how and with foreign countries, how they can trade and invest with each other. And you'd mentioned at the first part of your talk, who's going to pay these tariffs? Is it going to be the American consumers or the foreign exporters? Well, a lot of these tariffs won't be paid because the trade won't exist. Foreigners cannot afford to gain access to the American market paying these tariffs, and the Americans cannot afford to buy from foreigners with these tariffs in. There's going to be a shrinkage of world trade in all sorts of all of the connections that have been put in place for the last 80 years have been pulled up. And you're going to have such an interruption of trade that the real question of the BRICS facing them is, well, now if we can't export to the U.S. and we're not going to import from the U.S., how do we make our trade and investment with each other instead of with the United States? That's what they have to do. And all of that is going to require the creation of new international institutions, such as Russia and China are taking the lead in trying to promote. And the United States is trying to prevent this. They're trying to do everything they can to break up the creation of any alternative. And that's what the Americans themselves call this a clash of civilization. And it's really the American idea of civilization is you impose the neoliberal financialized economy that we have, and the alternative is autocracy, dictatorship, like America will say you have in China. But America's idea of democracy is client dictatorships. And the idea of democracy are countries that are growing and rejecting client dictatorships and taking sovereignty for themselves. And so it's really, we're dealing with a fight not between American civilization and the British civilization, but between barbarism and the very principle of civilization based on international law, equality of nations in terms of sovereignty, freedom from foreign interference, rules of war making, all the rules that have been smashed by American policy in the last few years.
Also, I'd like to just turn, in the few moments we have left, to turn the old free trade argument against all of it. The United States is closing itself by a wall of protection. All these prices are going to be raised by virtue of the tariffs imposed on them, more or less. And the important thing to keep in mind is that in the rest of the world that is not following suit, the prices will be lower than what they are in the United States. Some more lower, some less lower, but lower. And that begins to be built in to the price systems outside, that they become more and more differentiated from the monopoly protected prices inside the United States. And that will mean that the United States, as a capitalist totality, will be in a deteriorating competitive position with the rest of the world, because all the inputs here will be higher priced than their equivalents outside the protection zone. That's not a sustainable arrangement. Or to put it another way, that will become itself a mechanism that over time deteriorates and isolates the United States' capitalism from the rest of the world. So that's not a viable strategy either. It may look in the early moments of Mr. Trump throwing it around as some kind of remarkable innovation, but we all know that the history of capitalism is the history of oscillations between free trade and protection. We are not the first one to go through that. And the protection phase, which comes when free trade doesn't work, turns always out to be a dead end. In fact, that's why we go back to free trade again, because we have a revulsion against the problems of a protection. So this is not discovering a new solution. This is hankering after an old one that we should have learned doesn't work.
Well, this disparity in prices is exactly what Britain was dealing with 200 years ago. It saw that other countries had a natural price advantage because they could grow, for one thing, they could grow their food and produce raw materials much less expensively than Britain. So what did Britain do? Apart from reforming its own economy to lower its costs, it said, we're going to colonize these countries and we're going to invest in them. And if we can take ownership of their advantages, ownership of their land to produce food ownership of their raw materials, then instead of these countries getting the benefit of their low cost of production, our British and other colonialist European owners are going to have we're going to carve out our ownership of these countries' natural patrimony, their land, natural resources, and infrastructure for ourselves, and they'll be part of our own economy, not these economies. So this is what led this perception of the threat of lower prices abroad, led to British colonialism and imperialism and the development of financial imperialism in the form of multinational corporations buying control of all of the basic resources and assets that made these other countries more naturally competitive than Europe, with all of its burden of its aristocracy and all of the burden that it had. That's the kind of fight that is being waged today. It's as if we're seeing a new attempt by American to do what the European colonists did in taking over Africa and other countries and investing in the global South and taking ownership of their resources, denying the income from these resources to their host countries. This is host in the sense of host to a parasite taking out its value. This is exactly the fight that has to be recognized by the global majority countries, and I think it has been recognized by Lavrov's speech and by the Russians and certainly by the Chinese. But the problem is, how are you going to get BRICS to say this requires a really radical restructuring of the world order. This is a civilizational fight. How are we going to create a plan for this? And so far, they really haven't developed a plan. There was talking about de-dollarization as if somehow that could cure the problem, but that goes way beyond getting free of using the U.S. dollar. It's getting free of the whole finance capitalist rentier organization of the economy, to free the economy from this. And of course, that's what industrial capitalism was supposed to be doing as it evolved into socialism. So you're right. The BRICS and global South countries have to evolve into socialism. And the question is, can this be done without a revolution? We posed that at the end of the last show. It took a revolution in Russia in 1917, a revolution in China in 1945. Can the other BRICS countries and the global majority achieve this alternative to the U.S. European exploitation without a revolution? The United States is going to do whatever it can to fight against it, and that's what's going to be determining the next few years of international diplomacy.
Yes, and I want to remind everyone not to be too gloomy here, that when you saw the European economies go from the 19th century of more or less free trade to the 20th century's shifting over to colonization and protection of each colony, a set of colonial properties against the other, that eventuated in World Wars I and II. And we ought to wonder, one of the reasons you don't want to go down the road of protection accompanied by military forces to impose that protection. And notice that the budget just passed by Mr. Trump, expands the military and expands the police. That's so-called Homeland Security. Everything else is cut because you have to focus on protection in all the meanings of that word. That has led to war over and over again, especially as the beleaguered country tries to stop the others from protecting themselves. What happens if and when the BRICS, I'm not suggesting it, but if and when the BRICS were to sit down and to, as a unit, respond to the tariffs of the United States with a uniform tariff among them, where they are a common market and the United States is the excluded one. People with a memory will see here the very evolution of colonial empires, the American, the British, the German, the Japanese, which were the 20th century's causes of the greatest world wars the human race has ever seen. I mean, this is not a solution, what is being done here. This is an act of desperation coming out of the grabbing that Michael talked to us at the beginning today.
Well, to create a common market is exactly what China is trying to do with the Belt and Road Initiative. If you're going to have a trade among yourselves, you need transportation. You need the Belt and Road. And that's exactly what the United States militarily is trying to do, to block it in Afghanistan, in Iran with the Azeri and Azerbaijan activities. This is exactly what the geopolitical fight of the next few years is all about, trying to break the ability of other countries to work together and to tear up all of the connections, leaving no alternative but depend upon the United States and Europe. That's the new Cold War, and it is a war of what kind of civilization is the world going to have, or at least the world outside of the golden billion in the United States, Europe, and its allies.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Richard and Michael. Great pleasure as always. See you soon. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.